In this section, we get to discuss spinal nerves, which are part of the peripheral nervous system. This gives you a map of the various plexuses, which we will start to discuss later in this part. There are 3 to 4 major plexuses, depending on how you add them together. The cervical plexus, which is mostly going to be innervation of skin, cutaneous innervation. The brachial plexus, which is going to supply the upper extremity. The lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus, which is often merged together to form the lumbosacral plexus. Take a quick look at this diagram because it shows you the spinal cord. Again, the spinal cord ends at the level of around L1, L2. There is a cervical enlargement. There is also a lumbar enlargement. Those enlargements are slight increases in diameter of the spinal cord because that is where the nerve roots, which give rise to the brachial plexus and the lumbosacral plexuses, arise. You will remember that there will be both dorsal and ventral roots, which are associated with the spinal cord. The dorsal root is going to be carrying sensory information. The ventral root carries motor information. Those roots converge to form a single spinal nerve. And we just went over this. Remember that the cell bodies for the dorsal root are located in the dorsal root ganglion. The spinal nerve will branch into what are known as the dorsal and ventral rami. They will contain both sensory and motor fibers, so carry both sensory and motor information. Those rami communicantes are branches that are going to connect to the base of the ventral ramus and will lead to the sympathetic chain ganglia. This should look very familiar to you because it is a diagram of a spinal reflex arc. You can see that the sensory receptors are in the skin. That's going to carry sensory information along a sensory afferent neuron, which is a unipolar neuron by structure, to an integration center at the spinal cord. If there is a motor output, that will be carried along a motor neuron out to the effector, and in this case, it will be a skeletal muscle. If you take a look at this diagram, you can see the dorsal root and the ventral root, and those will merge to form the spinal nerve, which is labeled. That spinal nerve is going to form right at about the area of the intervertebral foramen. Foramen is the fancy word for hole. So in between each vertebrae, there will be a foramen known as an intervertebral foramen, and that is where the spinal nerve forms. And this shows you the nerve as well as the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus, as well as the sympathetic trunk ganglion. In the peripheral nervous system, there are 3 types of nerves. Sensory afferent, motor efferent. Those will be various cranial nerves. For example, a sensory afferent cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, or the optic nerve, cranial nerve 2. Motor efferent nerves that are cranial nerves are, for example, the ocular motor nerve, cranial nerve 3, or the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4. Most nerves are going to be mixed nerves. So the spinal nerves that we talk about will be mixed nerves. That means they carry both sensory and motor information. There will also be additional fibers. Don't panic when you look at these terms. Remember that somatic means body. Efferent means outgoing information, in other words, motor information. Afferent means incoming information, in other words, sensory information. And of course, visceral information is going to be from your body organs. So sure enough, those fibers are carrying muscles to or from the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and they're carrying information to or from the skin, muscles, your viscera, in other words, your internal organs, and your blood vessels. When we talk about the special somatic and visceral fibers, you are talking about cranial nerves. And when you talk about special somatic afferent fibers, you are talking about cranial nerves also. We have seen this. Remember that the covering around an axon, whether or not it is myelinated, will be the endoneurium. The axons will be bundled together in the peripheral nervous system into fascicles, which will be covered by a perineurium. And you'll have a cluster of fascicles grouped together to form a nerve, which will be covered by what is known as the epineurium. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they will contain thousands and thousands of neurons. They do connect to the spinal cord, and they are named for the point of issue from where they arise along the spinal cord. There are 8 pairs of cervical nerves, excuse me, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, and 5 pairs each of lumbar and sacral nerves. There's a single pair of coccygeal nerves. Let's talk briefly about dermatomes and myotomes. Dermatomes are specific areas of skin that will be bilateral. They are innervated by cutaneous branches of a single spinal nerve. Each pair of spinal nerves is associated with its very own dermatomes. Why are these important? They have pretty profound clinical significance. If you have ever had shingles or know of someone who has shingles, what is affected is that area of skin, that specific area of skin, which is a dermatome. So damage, trauma, infection of a spinal nerve or of the dorsal root ganglia will produce changes or loss of sensation in that corresponding region of skin. Let's take a look at the map. I will not put a marker on an image like this, for example, something here, and say, what dermatome is this? I provide this map so you can see the areas of skin that are associated with specific spinal roots.